Now, how do you enhance memory recall? This is a vital skill as a medical student and a doctor. How do you recall things that you previously studied? Now, studying effectively and efficiently requires techniques, and these techniques are absolutely vital, like I said, to both doctors and medical students. Now, as a medical student, you'll be learning the foundation of knowledge that you'll build upon as your career progresses, and you'll come back to this knowledge time and time again as a doctor. First, you want to use multiple resources, but not too many. Now, you're going to want to study more than simply the lectures and slides and textbook that your school gives you. What you're going to want to do, though, is follow along with your school curriculum with the lecturio videos simultaneously. The benefit here is that you'll cover whatever the school wants you to, but you'll have an excellent supplement to learn the high-yield information that's designed just for medical students. So that's lecture and then videos. The next thing you're going to want to do is read books that are considered high yield. And there's many high yield books on the market. The reason why this is important is that it gives you a good way to review what information is considered high yield. Now, that's something very important you're going to learn in medical school. Things are going to essentially be high yield or low yield. Or that means high yield is very clinically or exam relevant, and low yield is more minutia oriented or maybe not that important. Studying with a high yield source like the lecturio videos or having a high yield book will tell you what you should focus on initially. The third thing that you're going to need is to have access to what is called a reference book. A reference book is usually a very big, thick book that you reference to study material much more in depth. A reference book is full of low-yield information. But the value here is that when you're going to lecture and learning things, watching videos in the lecturio lectures, or looking at your high-yield book, there are going to be some topics where you think, you know what, I want some more detail. I need to learn a little bit more. I don't know enough background. And then you crack open the big reference book or the digital version, and then you look in there and you can read much more detail to give your brain an understanding of what you're reading to really understand the high-yield material. Now, research has shown that not all resources are the same. And if you notice, I gave you a mix. I told you to do some lecture, do some audio-visual lectures, to read some books, to use some reference, and here's why. Research has shown that if you just were to go to lecture, you're actually only going to retain 5%. That's absolutely despicably low. 5%, you miss 95% by going to lecture? That's the sad truth. So going to lecture alone, you retain 5%. If you're reading something, you retain 10%. I know you're thinking, Mo, you're wrong. I can retain almost everything. You'd be surprised. If you read, you really only retain about 10% for good recall. If you do something audio-visual, like those lecturio videos where you have someone talking and a visual sense going on, you're going to retain 20%. Now, we call this thing called demonstration. It's not really relevant to studying, but if you're learning something by hand or learning a concept visually, demonstration gives you 30%. If you were sitting in a group of study peers and discussing, you'll have a 50% recall. And if you actually practice by doing something, you'll have a 75% recall. And the gold here is teaching others or immediately using or implementing something that you've learned is a 90% recall. That's amazing, right? And that's what we're going to key in on. So if you've noticed, the recommendation we gave for good learning, you mix up these resources. You don't just rely on lecture alone. You don't just rely on reading alone. You want to mix all these up and try to get as much from each category as you can. Now, the second thing that you're going to need to do is to use flashcards. So, how do medical schools and medical boards test questions in physicians? Well, they do them in the form of exam questions. That's how we get tested. Now, flashcards are simply just that. A fun way for you to test your knowledge against yourself in a no judgment, no consequence manner. What you're going to do is to take flashcards and you're going to create them by writing a question on one side of them. And then on the back side, you're going to put the answer. In this way, you're coming up with questions on your own and then challenging your memory, challenging your recall to come up with them on the back. And in this way, you're essentially testing yourself. You're asking yourself a question, like medical schools and medical board exams do, and then getting to see the answer in a risk-free environment. Now, that's a paper way of doing it with physical flashcards. You can also do it digitally. There is this program called Anki, and that's a great tool for creating and testing yourself on flashcards. And you can just Google Anki, and it's a free software to use. Now, the third concept, and absolutely important, is the concept of spaced repetition with your flashcards. Now, research has shown that short bursts of studying over time and repeatedly testing yourself on what you have learned is the absolute best technique for long-term recall of material. Now, this means that on your study schedule that you're going to create, you need to study material the absolute same day it's taught. Now, we emphasize this. When you go to lecture and you come back home, study that day's material. And then every 2 or 3 days thereafter, you need to review that material again. Now, an efficient way to do this is to use that free computer software we talked about called Anki. Now, what this software does is it allows you to keep coming back to your flashcards. So say on day 1, you reviewed some material, you made your flashcards, and you studied them that day. And 2 to 3 days later, you go back to that flashcard deck and you see them again. And over time, your flashcard deck will grow as you go to more and more lectures. But the benefit will be you'll keep seeing old material as you're seeing today's new material and having what's called spaced repetition, which is absolutely going to increase your recall. Now, the fourth skill here is you do not want to cram. Now, emergencies do happen, that's life, and sometimes you have to cram. But research has also shown that cramming will only keep knowledge in your head for just a few days. And after that, it's going to be difficult to near impossible to actually recall. Thus, you want to avoid cramming at all costs and only do it in the case of emergencies. Now, how do you read quickly and retain